Hey there! I'm going to show you how I made a D&D spellbook prop that also doubles as a real notebook. Like this one. And as an added challenge, I'm going to mainly use supplies I procured from the dollar store so I don't break the bank. The supplies you will need from the dollar store, here in Canada I went to Dollarama, are a 9x12-inch spiral-bound notebook with hard covers, one of these craft paper pads or some black cardstock, a few packages of these synthetic leather squares to get enough of one color, some white PVA glue. I didn't actually buy glue from the dollar store because I have lots, like way too much. You also need some linen or waxed thread. I started this crafting adventure by removing all the paper from the sketchbook. I started tearing the paper out and quickly decided a full disassembly was needed and would be easier. And keep the covers because we'll be using those later. Then cleaned up the paper by tearing off the edges. I folded 3 sheets of paper at a time in half to make signatures for the book. I found with this paper that 4 sheets was too much and 3 was just right. After folding all of the sheets, I stacked the signatures under some weights to press them into shape. Then I sewed the text blocks using link stitch. I marked 6 holes across one of the signatures with a pencil, and then transferred those marks to the rest of the signatures using a straight edge. I waxed some linen thread. I threaded the needle and doubled the thread, tying a knot at the end. Start from the middle of the first signature in the pile. You just want to make sure you grab the signatures in order so the holes line up. From left to right, we'll number these holes 1 to 6. Sew in and out of the 6 holes and back to the first hole. And then sew out of the first hole again. Pick up the next signature in order, then sew into the first hole. Sew out the second hole and sew under the outside threads in the last signature. This creates the link in link stitch. Then sew into the third hole. Sew out of the fourth hole and under the threads on the last signature. Sew into the fifth hole. Then out the sixth hole. Tie a kettle stitch at the end of the row. You do this by sewing under the threads between the last 2 signatures and tying a knot. Then sew into the 6th hole of the next signature. When you sew out the 5th hole, sew under the threads of the last signature again. Sew back into the 4th hole and out the 3rd hole. Then sew under the threads of the last signature and back into the 2nd hole. When you sew out the first hole, make another kettle stitch before continuing the same stitching with the next signature. Continue sewing across each new signature, linking the new signatures by sewing under the stitches between the 2nd and 3rd holes and the 4th and 5th holes of the previous signatures. Making sure to tie a kettle stitch at the end before joining a new signature. When I finished sewing the text block, I rounded the spine before applying the first coat of glue. This was easy for me to do, I think, because my stitches weren't too tight. In a bit, I'll be wishing I used a different stitch for the spine, but we'll get to that later. No point crying over spilt milk or crafting mishaps, even if you want to. So I didn't think to buy some ribbon from the dollar store, so I made one by sticking 2 pieces of thin washi tape together. And yes, the washi tape was purchased from the dollar store at one point, so it counts. I then glued the bookmark to the spine and reinforced the spine with some mull, which was not from the dollar store, so that one's on me. You could use a piece of paper here instead or another thin piece of material. Then I cut the front and back covers down to size for the book from one of the covers I removed earlier. I then marveled at my own lack of foresight. Had I used some jute, basically thick twine, I could have glued the cover boards to that. But I didn't. So I decided to cut a piece of cardstock from the craft paper pad I bought to act as an attachment point for the covers. I cut a strip of cardstock and glued it to the spine, leaving enough paper on the front and back to glue on the cover boards. This worked, but it wasn't perfect. I then glued on the cover boards and left the almost book under a board and some dinosaurs to dry. Dinosaurs are great weights, by the way. I decided to use the faux leather or synthetic leather squares I bought for the cover material. However, the squares were a tad bit tiny. So I selected the colors I liked and sewed them together to make a larger piece of material. I sewed 2 panels of black together for the front and 2 for the back. I then cut a piece of red in half-ish and sewed the red together. I then sewed the red to the front and back panels. At one point I sewed the material together the wrong way, and I was glad I left enough that I could cut off the stitch edge and start over. There may have been some curse words uttered at this point. To add a bit of spice, I sewed a jagged row along the middle seam to make the piece appear hand sewn. While I was pretty happy with the result and how badass I was for making a bigger piece of material out of basically scraps, I felt the cover lacked something sinister. So I popped onto the internet and I found just the thing. And it worked with my color scheme too. Fancy. I printed off the Asmodeus symbol and glued it to the back of a piece of red leather with a glue stick. Then cut out the design with a pair of scissors. I then used some more glue to tack the design to the cover. Then I hand stitched around the whole thing to create that evil handmade look. As if a not-so-good wizard in a dark tower really wanted to design her own spellbook, but didn't know how to sew. That's me. I'm that wizard. Then I procrastinated for a bit because the next part always stresses me out. I glued on the spine of the book to the cover material first and let that dry before moving on to the covers. I then glued the covers on and let them dry for a bit under a weight. Then I trimmed the edges and cut the corners, cut some angle cuts at the spine of the book as well. I then glued down the edges to the inside covers. I left this section to dry for a bit again before moving on. I am not a professional, so please don't use my methods as bookbinding gospel. It's just my quirky little way I do things. Then I used 2 pieces of cardstock from the craft pad for the end sheets. The paper wasn't quite long enough and I always have trouble with this part. It's finicky. So finicky. I kind of low-key hates it. I glued down the end sheets first to the last page on either end, and then slowly to the inside covers so I don't mess it up. Like I said, they are too short, but since I was trying to only use the dollar store supplies, I couldn't substitute them. It won't be perfect, but the not-so-evil wizard doesn't mind, because it's what she puts in it that matters. Some blood, a little sweat, and lots of tears. Or was that the other way around? Perhaps a little more blood. If you'd prefer scrolls to write your spells in, watch this video next. Thanks for watching. My name is Pam, and this is Total Pamarchy, the craft channel with a little anarchy. Until next time, toodles! Bye.